They thought it was just another truck, a few crates of cement, a routine checkpoint. Nothing unusual on the dusty Sahel road where the wind carries red sand and the sun beats down like a hammer on iron. But when the customs officers lifted the lid, they uncovered the kind of secret that changes a nation's heartbeat. Explosives, cyanide, counterfeit drugs, enough to poison rivers, flatten towns, and flood markets with death. It wasn't cargo, it was a declaration of war hidden in plain sight. Burkina Faso had seen storms before, coups, poverty, terror, but this was different. This was a battle fought not on the front lines, but in silence, by men and women whose names would never make the news. They were customs officers, border sentinels, and ordinary citizens standing between order and oblivion. Under the steady command of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, their mission became something larger than law enforcement. It became a test of the nation's soul. Could Burkina Faso protect itself without bowing to fear or foreign help? That answer began here, at a lonely checkpoint on the edge of the desert where vigilance met destiny, and a country long written off began to write its own story. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. What you are about to witness is not just a story of seizures and checkpoints. It is a story of men and women who chose vigilance over silence, dignity over dependency. If this resonates with your sense of justice, show your support with a like, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to join us on this journey. Because stories like this one deserve to be told, remembered, and carried forward. To understand what happened at the border, you must first understand the ground beneath it. Burkina Faso, its name means the land of honest men, sits in the heart of the Sahel, a vast belt of dust and fire stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. For decades, this land was spoken of only through tragedy. Terror attacks, hunger, coups, the kind of headlines that make the world look away. The soil was rich, but the harvest was sorrow. The people were strong, but the state was weak. But something changed in the autumn of 2022. A young officer, barely in his 30s, stepped forward. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He did not arrive with fanfare. He did not promise miracles. He spoke of dignity, of sovereignty, of rebuilding a state that had forgotten how to stand. Many dismissed him as another soldier with a flag and a speech. They had seen this before, men in uniform making promises, then disappearing into the same cycles of failure and neglect. But the people, tired of waiting for miracles from abroad, saw something else. They saw discipline, they saw duty, and they saw a refusal to kneel. Under his command, the state began to awaken. Institutions long treated as bureaucratic relics, customs, agriculture, the civil guard, were pulled into a new doctrine. One uniform, one nation. The message was clear. Every public servant, from a soldier in the desert to an inspector at the border, carried the same mission: to protect life, not just law. In those early months, reforms cut deep. Checkpoints that had once been trading posts for smugglers turned into fortresses of accountability. Officers received new training, not from foreign advisors, but from their own military engineers and intelligence officers. For the first time in years, civilians and soldiers saluted the same command. And through it all, Traoré repeated the same phrase in every speech: "We cannot defend our dignity with borrowed courage." That philosophy reached the Customs Directorate in early 2025. The men and women there knew the stakes. Across the border in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, a dark economy had flourished. Smugglers moving gold dust, cyanide, counterfeit medicine, and even weapons through the porous Sahel roads. It wasn't just about money. Each barrel of chemicals meant poisoned rivers. Each hidden explosive meant another ambush waiting to happen. And each fake pill meant another family mourning a child who should have lived. The numbers told a grim story. In 2024 alone, Burkina Faso's customs force impounded contraband worth more than 5 billion CFA francs, approximately 8.3 million United States dollars. Among the seized goods, 203 tons of cyanide, 118 tons of banned pharmaceuticals, 76,715 explosive sticks, 11 AK-47 assault rifles, 5,125 rounds of ammunition. These were not abstract figures on a spreadsheet. They were lives saved, villages spared, rivers kept clean. But behind those numbers lay stories, human stories, stories of officers who slept in trucks, of families who did not know if their loved ones would return from the border, of young men and women who chose to stand guard when the world had already looked away. Before we move forward, let us pause here. Take a moment to leave a comment with the words, "Thank you." Perhaps, "Thank you, Traoré," or "Thank you, Burkina Faso," or simply, "Thank you for hope and dignity." Why does this matter? Because each thank you is not just a word. It is recognition. It is solidarity. It is a seed of encouragement planted in the soil of change. Imagine hundreds of voices joining together, saying, "We see this, we honor this, we stand with this." So write your thank you now and let it grow with us. At a small station near Gao, a young inspector noticed something odd. A truck carrying cement with papers dated a week before the cargo crossed the frontier. It was just one line of ink, a small discrepancy, the kind of detail most officers would wade through without a second glance. But this inspector had been trained under the new doctrine: watch, listen, trust your instincts. He radioed his superior. The response was immediate: do not stop the truck, follow it, watch where it goes. Days became weeks, and a pattern emerged. Shipments entering from the southwest, always at dusk, always declared as construction material. But no construction ever followed. The cement never reached a building site. The trucks vanished into the rural roads, re-emerging days later, empty and clean. As officers mapped the routes, they realized the scale of what they were facing. This was not petty contraband. It was an artery of destruction feeding both criminal networks and insurgent cells. If it continued unchecked, it could choke the nation from within. The customs director convened a secret task force, 6 officers, 2 vehicles, no publicity. Their orders were simple: watch, listen, and do not act until you see the full picture. For 3 months, they moved in silence, sleeping in trucks, eating from ration packs, blending among traders at dusty markets. They spoke little, they wrote everything, and they waited for one mistake. That mistake came when a convoy attempted to bypass the main checkpoint entirely, veering onto an unmarked dirt road leading east. By then, the team had gathered enough evidence to act. They knew the routes, they knew the players, they knew the pattern. The trap was set. This was not happening in isolation. Across West Africa, a coordinated effort was underway. Operation Screen West Africa, led by Interpol, involving 12 countries including Burkina Faso, had been tracking cross-border trafficking networks since late 2024. The operation would eventually lead to 45 arrests and the seizure of contraband worth millions. In Burkina Faso alone, officers seized 10 tons of amphetamines, a synthetic drug that had flooded the region, funding armed groups and destroying communities. But the officers on the ground did not think in terms of international headlines. They thought in terms of duty, of the Muhon River where families drank and bathed, of the villages where children played in the dust, of the roads where trucks should carry food, not death. Under a gray dawn, they moved in. No gunfire, just a sharp crack of commands and the metallic echo of handcuffs. Inside the trucks, under layers of salmon dust, they found what the papers never said: Sealed barrels with no manufacturer's mark. Boxes stamped with foreign alphabets, labels that meant nothing to customs databases, but everything to those who knew how to read the language of smuggling. One officer later recalled, "It smelled like danger before we even opened it." They called headquarters immediately. Within an hour, military engineers arrived from the nearest garrison, their trucks raising clouds of red dust across the savannah. They had no idea yet how deep this would go, but in that moment they knew one thing for certain. The border of Burkina Faso was no longer geography. It was a front line in a hidden war, and somewhere beyond those sealed barrels lay a truth powerful enough to shake the nation awake. By the time the first barrel was unsealed, the customs officers formed a circle, gloves trembling slightly as they lifted the lid. The stench hit them first, sharp, metallic, unnatural. Inside was not cement dust, not oil, not anything meant for trade. It was explosive powder, neatly packed in bags labeled with codes no one recognized. The engineers worked quietly, their faces hidden behind protective masks. One of them whispered, "This isn't for mining. Someone meant to kill with this." The words fell like a sentence. For months, intelligence units had warned of shadow markets feeding insurgent groups in the Sahel. Now, those shadows had a smell, a weight, and a location, here, inside the borders of Burkina Faso. Each discovery led to another. Beneath the explosives, they found sealed containers filled with cyanide. It shimmered in the light, deceptively beautiful, deadly enough to wipe out a village if it spilled into the rivers below. A junior officer, barely 24 years old, stood frozen. He had grown up near the Mahun River, where families drink, bathe, and farm. The thought struck him like a blow. If this had leaked, it would have poisoned everything I'd ever known. He whispered, "We're not just guarding lines, we're guarding life itself." This was not the first time Burkina Faso had confronted such threats. Just months earlier, on the 10th of November 2025, customs officers at Kaya, a town near the northern border, had seized 100 barrels of cyanide hidden beneath empty cement bags on a commercial truck. The Burkina Information Agency described the discovery as an insidious threat against our security, our water resources, our fish and wildlife, and the very future of our country. The transport of cyanide in unregulated conditions posed severe environmental and health risks, especially in a country where illegal artisanal mining often involved the uncontrolled use of toxic substances. The chemical, used in gold extraction, could devastate ecosystems if mishandled. One spill could poison a river for generations. Word reached Captain Ibrahim Traoré's headquarters by nightfall. He ordered absolute silence, no press, no statements. Until the network was dismantled, secrecy was their shield. He sent the message directly to the customs director. "Do not think of this as a seizure. Think of it as war." For the next 72 hours, teams fanned out across border roads, checking waybills, intercepting calls, tracing where the barrels came from and who financed them. They discovered a pattern of ghost companies registered in neighboring countries, all linked to a single front business that claimed to import agricultural supplies. Behind the paperwork lay a chain of traffickers working with precision. Chemicals for illegal gold mining, explosives repurposed for armed groups, counterfeit pharmaceuticals pushed through rural markets where no one asked questions. This was part of a wider regional problem. Operation Sanu, coordinated by Interpol between July and October of 2024, had targeted illegal mining across Burkina Faso, Gambia, Guinea, and Senegal. That operation led to 200 arrests and the seizure of dangerous chemicals, 150 kilograms of cyanide, 325 kilograms of active charcoal, 14 cylinders of mercury valued at over 100,000 United States dollars, 20 liters of nitric acid, and two 57-liter containers of sulfuric acid. The mercury alone, seized in Burkina Faso, represented a catastrophic environmental threat. When investigators raided one warehouse near Bobo Dioulasso, they found crates of fake antibiotics stacked beside boxes of spoiled meat, both intended for local sale. It was not just smuggling, it was a system feeding death through daily commerce. And then came the night that defined it all. At 2 in the morning, a convoy of trucks tried to cross under cover of fog. The customs task force was waiting. There was no gunfire, only headlights cutting through the mist and the sound of engines surrendering one by one. Inside the last truck, they found something none of them expected: detonators wrapped in brown paper, and a small note written in French: "Delivery complete. Payment expected in Gao." That single sentence connected the smuggling route to insurgent cells across the Mali frontier. The discovery changed everything. What began as an investigation into contraband had exposed a network designed to destabilize the state from within. One officer said later, "We used to think of the borders as places where trade begins. Now we know they are where our survival begins." Pause for a moment here and share with us where you are watching this video. Is it from Africa, from Europe, from the Americas, or perhaps from a small village whose name the world has never heard? Type it in the comments. Your city, your country, your corner of the earth. Because every place matters, every voice counts. The New Africa Story wants to thank you personally and to send a blessing across the distance. May freedom, dignity, and vigilance walk beside you wherever you are. Let the comments below become not just words, but bridges of solidarity stretching across the globe. When the explosives were secured and the convoys impounded, the officers thought the worst was behind them. They were wrong. In the following days, as investigators cataloged each seized item, they uncovered another layer of the same rot: counterfeit drugs, expired vaccines, boxes of cigarettes mixed with toxic chemicals, frozen chicken half rotten under the sun. It was a different kind of weapon, one that didn't explode, but killed quietly, in hospital beds and at kitchen tables. At the customs yard, a senior officer held up a box of antibiotics. It looked genuine, sealed, printed with a European logo. Inside, laboratory tests found chalk powder and traces of arsenic. He placed it down carefully, as if it were a bomb. "Every tablet like this," he said, "is another coffin sold for profit." This was the other war, the war against the invisible. No uniforms, no battlefields, only greed armed with labels and paperwork. For decades, fake medicines had circulated across West Africa, slipping past checkpoints, killing quietly in remote clinics where doctors worked by candlelight. The scale was staggering. In 2024, Burkina Faso's customs force seized 118 tons of banned pharmaceuticals, valued at 1.25 billion CFA francs. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a continental crisis. Operation Pangea 17, a global effort coordinated between December 2024 and May 2025, led to 769 arrests worldwide and the seizure of 50.4 million doses of illegal pharmaceuticals worth 65 million United States dollars. In Burkina Faso, officers discovered 816,000 tablets, including analgesics and anti-inflammatories, hidden inside vehicles. The trend was being driven by the widespread promotion of these medicines across social media and online marketplaces, creating lucrative and relatively low-risk opportunities for criminal networks selling low-quality or counterfeit products. Among the officers leading the health inspection was a young woman named Awa. She was one of the few female inspectors in her unit, responsible for examining perishable goods, meat, fish, frozen poultry smuggled from unknown sources. When one container was opened, the smell was unbearable. Inside lay what had once been food, now blackened, decomposing, crawling with insects. Awa turned away, holding her breath. Later, she said quietly, "They wanted to feed this to our children." Her words lingered like smoke. In that moment, the officers realized their job was not just about enforcing customs law. It was about defending the invisible walls of decency, the unseen moral borders between care and neglect. The cyanide barrels were sent to the army for controlled destruction. The fake drugs were cataloged, photographed, and burned. As the flames rose, an old officer murmured, "This is not waste. This is evil leaving the ground." Nobody laughed. Nobody disagreed. For weeks afterward, the scene haunted them. The smell of rot, the blue shimmer of chemicals, the silence that followed the fire. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about reclaiming dignity, about saying no to a trade that treated Africa's people as expendable. Awa kept one photograph from that day, a crate marked "Made for Humanitarian Aid." She taped it to her locker as a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a label of mercy. And somewhere in the capital, Ibrahim Traoré read the first internal report from the customs director. He wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page. "A nation begins to heal when its people learn what to refuse." When the investigation was over, the headlines never came. No parades, no speeches, just silence, and the sound of trucks hauling barrels away under military escort. The operation was never meant for glory. It was meant for safety. At the customs base outside Ouagadougou, the officers gathered in the early hours, uniforms stained with dust and sweat. Some had not slept for days. Their faces showed exhaustion, but also something deeper: relief, pride, and disbelief at what they had stopped. The Director General stood before them, his voice steady but raw. "Customs is not about revenue," he said. "It is about life. Every checkpoint you hold, every truck you stop, is an act of protection." He looked at them one by one. Most were young, some barely older than the weapons they had just seized. They had risked their lives without firing a single bullet, in a region where every border crossing could turn into an ambush. That silence was their victory. The explosives and cyanide were transferred to the army for destruction. Military engineers arrived at dawn, men in heavy suits moving with the precision of surgeons. They carried each barrel into a clearing beyond the city, setting them in rows beneath the open sky. The barrels stood there like silent tombstones, each one a life that would not be lost, a river that would not be poisoned, a village that would not burn. The soldiers stood back. The countdown began. When the blast came, it wasn't just noise. It was release. A column of dark smoke rose slowly into the air, twisting above the treetops before dissolving into the morning light. The sound echoed across the savannah, a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very soil beneath their feet. For a long moment, no one moved. The officers and soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the smoke climb and disperse. Then one of the soldiers whispered, "It's over." But everyone knew it was more than that. That smoke meant more than the end of a smuggling ring. It was a symbol, the burning away of corruption, the cleansing of a wound. In that moment, the soldiers and customs officers stood side by side, uniforms different, but purpose the same. They saluted the rising sun as the last echoes faded into silence. Someone murmured, "The sky looks cleaner today." Back in the capital, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was briefed on the operation. He listened without interruption, his hands folded, eyes fixed on the photographs, barrels, boxes, the rising smoke. When the report ended, he said only one thing. They didn't just stop a crime. They proved we can protect ourselves. Those words spread quietly through the ranks. No slogans, no orders, just belief. In the following weeks, young recruits began referring to themselves not as customs officers, but as the Guardians. It became a badge of honor, an unspoken vow. The numbers told part of the story. In 2024 alone, Burkina Faso's Customs Directorate impounded contraband worth more than 5 billion CFA francs, approximately 8.3 million United States dollars. Among the seized items, 203 tons of cyanide, 1,284.5 kilograms of mercury, 98 tons of banned fertilizers, 118 tons of prohibited pharmaceuticals, 11 AK-47 assault rifles, 5,125 rounds of ammunition, and 76,715 explosive sticks. But numbers alone could not capture what had been defended. The rivers that still ran clear, the children who drank clean water, the families who bought medicine that would heal, not kill, the farmers who tilled soil not poisoned by illegal mining runoff. Across the country, from the gold fields of Gawa to the dusty roads of Kaya, the story traveled by word of mouth. Farmers told it to their sons, teachers told it to their students. At every border post, new signs were painted. The nation watches. For the first time in years, the people felt the state was not distant, not invisible, but standing right beside them. Every seized barrel was a message, every checkpoint a prayer that the next generation would inherit a country strong enough to defend its own soul. And so, under the same sky that once carried the smoke of destruction, Burkina Faso began to rise, quietly, firmly, and without permission. News of the operation did not break on television. It moved slowly, like a rumor, whispers across embassies and intelligence briefings. In Washington, analysts at the State Department read the first classified cables and raised their brows. A small, landlocked nation, once considered fragile, dependent, and fractured, had just dismantled one of the largest smuggling networks in West Africa, without foreign advisors, without external funding, and without a single casualty. For some, it was impressive. For others, unsettling. In an era when global aid defines who gets to survive, a country standing on its own terms is rarely celebrated. Reports trickled into European capitals. In Paris, commentators spoke cautiously of a new assertiveness in the Sahel. In Brussels, bureaucrats wondered if this was a sign of the sovereignty wave rising across Africa. And in Washington, one veteran diplomat who had served in the region decades earlier said something that few dared to repeat aloud. When Africans start solving their own crises, the world loses its favorite story. But beyond politics, something more subtle was shifting. Across the continent, nations watched. In Mali, in Niger, in Guinea. The footage of Burkina's officers standing beside soldiers, smoke rising behind them, became a quiet symbol. A photograph passed through encrypted apps, shared in small newsrooms and university halls. It said one thing: we can protect ourselves. African journalists began referring to it as the dawn at Ouagadougou. For them, it wasn't about nationalism or defiance. It was about dignity. A reminder that the same soil once called unstable could also grow courage. Meanwhile, Western think tanks issued cautious analysis. Could Burkina's model, civil-military cooperation built on national resources, be sustainable? Could it hold without external support? The question missed the point. The victory was not logistical. It was psychological. It had redefined what it meant to be independent in an age of dependency. In a rare interview months later, Ibrahim Traoré was asked what message he wanted the world to hear. He paused for a long time before answering. "We are not against the world," he said softly. "We are simply for ourselves." Those words echoed far beyond Africa. In a time when nations build walls and alliances fracture, one of the poorest countries on earth had delivered a lesson in unity, discipline, and faith. And as one American journalist wrote in a quiet column few noticed, maybe sovereignty isn't about power. Maybe it's about standing guard when no one else will. The morning after the destruction, the ground outside Ouagadougou was quiet again. The smoke that had darkened the horizon had vanished, leaving only a faint scent of metal and ash. What remained was not debris, but proof. Proof that vigilance could save more than borders. It could save belief. At the customs headquarters, the Director General stood with his officers. Their uniforms were clean now, their eyes heavier. He thanked them not with medals, but with words. "You have done something rare in our time. You have protected without hatred. You have fought without war." Those words marked a new beginning. The government launched what it called the Vigilance Program, a partnership between civilians, local watch groups, and the military. The concept was simple but radical. Turn every citizen into a sentinel. Train them not to fear the border, but to defend it. Farmers were trained to report strange convoys. Truckers learned how to verify cargo seals. Market vendors were taught to recognize counterfeit pharmaceuticals. Communities once forgotten became the first line of defense. In villages near the southern frontier, people began calling themselves guardians of the nation. They painted it on their doors, their trucks, their market stalls, not out of propaganda, but pride. For the first time, they saw themselves as part of something larger than survival. The program did not rely on foreign consultants or international NGOs. It was built from within, drawing on local knowledge, traditional structures, and a shared sense of purpose. Elders who had lived near the borders for decades shared their wisdom about smuggling routes. Young men and women volunteered to serve as community liaisons, reporting suspicious activity without waiting for orders from the capital. The technology helped too. In April 2025, Burkina Faso installed a state-of-the-art security system featuring CCTV and tracking technology at key border crossings. The dividends were immediate and visible. Within days, officers detected 800 bags of cyanide smuggled as animal feed, valued at more than 170 million CFA francs. Lorries smuggling cereals were identified and intercepted. As one social media observer noted, when Traoré talked about the fight against corruption, he was deadly serious. The system was transforming security leadership in Burkina Faso, proving that investment in domestic capacity could yield results that foreign aid never could. But the program was not without challenges. Could this vigilance last? Could it stand against the pressure of poverty, corruption, and temptation that had undone so many efforts before? The answer was uncertain. But perhaps that uncertainty was the point. Vigilance is not a destination. It is a discipline, a choice made every single day. One evening, an old customs veteran visited the clearing where the explosives had been burned. He stood there for a long time, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The soil was dark, the air still. He picked up a handful of ash and let it fall through his fingers. To anyone else, it was nothing. To him, it was the weight of everything they had fought for. He whispered, "The ashes of what we destroyed are the seeds of what we become." In the distance, children's laughter echoed from a nearby village. Life had resumed. Trucks rumbled on the horizon. The same roads that once carried death now carried harvests and hope. And somewhere in the capital, as the last report was filed, Ibrahim Traoré looked out from his office window toward the west. The same sun that had once risen over rebellion now rose over renewal. He knew the road ahead would be long, the enemies unseen. But for the first time, the nation no longer waited for rescue. The fire had burned the poison away. What remained was discipline, courage, and the quiet promise that Burkina Faso would guard itself, whatever the cost. Before we close this chapter, let us pause together. What you have just witnessed is not simply a customs operation or a security victory. It is a reminder that sovereignty, dignity, and vigilance are still alive, waiting to be claimed by those brave enough to stand guard. If this story has stirred something in you, if it has reminded you that freedom must be defended every single day, then subscribe to the New Africa Story. Not because we ask for numbers, but because we are building a space where voices of independence are honored, where stories of pride continue to be told, and where the next chapter of Africa's unfolding journey is waiting to be written. Subscribe now and walk with us into what comes next. Because the story you have just heard is not an ending, it is an opening. And the next chapter may be the one that changes everything. When history remembers Burkina Faso, it may not recall the barrels, the seizures, or the endless nights of surveillance. It may remember something quieter. A few men and women standing in the dust, refusing to let harm cross the border. No fanfare, no applause, just duty carried out with the steadiness of faith. In a century defined by dependence, this small nation has dared to write a different story, one of responsibility instead of rescue. They have shown that sovereignty is not a word for flags and speeches. It is a daily act of defense, a choice to protect what others take for granted, the right to safety, the right to stand unbroken. For the people of Burkina Faso, vigilance has become more than a strategy. It is a prayer, a promise whispered each dawn that their children will not inherit fear, but freedom. The threats have not disappeared. Across the Sahel, smuggling networks continue to adapt. Insurgent groups still seek footholds. Counterfeit medicines still circulate in markets where oversight is thin. But something fundamental has changed. The state is no longer passive. The people are no longer alone. In May 2025, customs officers confiscated 900 motorcycles and other infrastructure imported into the country for terroristic purposes. The discovery was made possible by the vigilance of dedicated civil servants working under the system Ibrahim Traoré had built. As one observer noted, he is smashing the logistics network every single day. We will win. In November 2025, at Puitenga near the southeastern border, customs officers seized 7 tons of cyanide and 72 cartons of amphetamines hidden in trucks from Ghana. The substances were linked to illegal gold mining and criminal networks that had operated with impunity for years. The operation was described as another blow against an insidious threat to our security. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a continuous effort to defend not just territory, but values. To say no to exploitation, to refuse the normalization of death disguised as commerce. And perhaps for those of us watching from far away, from the comfort of our own peace, there is a lesson here. That freedom is not kept by might alone, but by conscience. That every border, whether of land or principle, survives only when someone has the courage to stand guard. The world has spent decades telling Africa what it cannot do, what it cannot build, what it cannot protect. Burkina Faso has offered a different answer, not with speeches or slogans, but with silent action. With officers who chose vigilance over corruption, with communities that chose solidarity over suspicion, with a leader who chose sovereignty over dependence. This is not a story of perfection, Burkina Faso still faces profound challenges: poverty, violence, the scars of decades of instability. But it is a story of direction, of a nation choosing to face its problems with its own hands, its own courage, its own resources. The smoke that rose over Ouagadougou was not just the destruction of contraband. It was a signal, a message sent to every corner of the Sahel and beyond. A message that said, we are still here, we are still standing, and we will not kneel. So tonight, as the world moves on and headlines fade, remember this small country in the Sahel. Remember Ibrahim Traoré, who stood without reward and spoke the language of dignity when the world preferred the language of dependency. Remember Burkina Faso, where customs officers became guardians, where borders became altars of vigilance, and where the smoke rose like a second sunrise, not to obscure the future, but to clear the way for it. Remember the rivers that still run clean because someone chose to stand watch. Remember the children who took medicine that healed because someone refused to let poison cross the border. Remember the villages that sleep in peace because someone, somewhere, stayed awake. And remember that somewhere between vigilance and sacrifice lies the true measure of a nation. Not in the wealth it accumulates or the wars it wins, but in the quiet choices made by ordinary people to protect what is sacred. If you still believe freedom must be guarded, type justice in the comments below. Let those words stand as a testament, a digital monument to the idea that dignity is not given, but claimed, that sovereignty is not granted, but built, and that the future belongs to those who refuse to surrender it. Subscribe to the New Africa Story. Share this video. Let it travel beyond borders and algorithms, reaching those who still believe that Africa's story is not written by others, but by Africans themselves. Because the next chapter is already being written. In the clearings where ashes settle, in the checkpoints where officers still stand guard. In the hearts of a people who have learned that the greatest victories are often the quietest and the most enduring. The hidden war is not over. But for the first time in a long time, those who fight it are not fighting alone. They fight with the knowledge that the nation watches, that the people stand with them, and that somewhere on a dusty road in the Sahel, vigilance still meets destiny. And when it does, a country long written off continues to write its own story. One checkpoint, one seizure, one quiet act of courage at a time.